Hello and welcome to Clay to Canopy, the show where I attempt to make just about everything from the ground up. Today I am going to be making some bent lamination lanterns inspired by mountain laurel with the aid of my Cricut. So come on, let's do this. Lamination is probably my second favorite woodworking process. I think my all-time favorite process is stacking and carving like I did for the peanut. But the bent lamination process is another process that I really have fallen in love with in woodworking school. It lends itself really well to sculpture. I have done a video previously on how to make bent lamination jigs where I made a basket. I was a little stiff then, it was in my early videos, but I will link that in the description if you want to check out how to do it the traditional old school way. But today I am going to put my Cricut to the test and see if I can't get it to make a template that I can then use over on my router to create my jig. Now, one of the biggest pains when it comes to making your bent laminations is not necessarily even the glue up or the cleanup of the curves. For me, I think it is really getting the precision and the curve to be nice and clean in your original template. Whoa, that camera is rocking like crazy right now. It is a windy day. Anyhow, I specifically bought the maker because I wanted it to cut into wood, and I know that it did chipboard. I have purchased heavy chipboard from Cricut, and my goal is to see if I can't get the Cricut to cut my perfect curved template. This process will save my hands from dealing with the endless amounts of sanding, and if this works out, then this will be a total option to go to for some smaller-ish kind of curves. I have a 12 by 12, but you can get a 12 by 24 mat. So the longest curve you're going to be able to get would be 24 inches. But if you could stack your templates. I do not know if they make 24-inch long chipboard. I have tried using the kind of stuff you get at Home Depot. Even cutting a balsa wood using the craft knife has been a bit tricky. I've burned through a lot of blades and I've burned through a lot of wood. I purchased their brand to make sure that I'm using it the way that they intended. What I did learn with cutting the wood is I ended up not even using the craft knife with my wood samples. I ended up using the deep cut blade, which tend to give me a better, cleaner cut. I'm gonna cut this first, the way that the Cricut says to do it, and if that doesn't work out, we're gonna do some jiggering. Alright, the first thing I did was to sketch up my curve that was inspired by mountain laurel. So these are gonna be lanterns that are inspired by the shape of the mountain laurel flower. Now my curve is a little bit rounder than what the flower would have. On the outside of the flower, there's a little bit of a bumpiness. You really can't have any jagged changes going on in the mold. You really want a smooth curve. So I have rounded over some of the areas on that curve to give it an easier bend. I took my sketch, scanned it into the computer, and went through Photoshop and Illustrator to convert it to an SVG file. I did recently do a vision board where I made some tiny houses, and I went through that process. So if you're interested in looking at the process on how to convert your pictures or your images to SVG files using Photoshop and Illustrator, I will link that video below, shameless plug. Check that out. I'm gonna skip those parts today. We're just gonna jump in right onto the Cricut interface and go from there. So I have imported my mountain laurel curve onto my interface, and the one thing that I know is that when I go to shoot this into the cutter, it is going to cut around the outside of this line, and it's going to end up leaving me this gap cut out. I'm going to try to duplicate this because this gap potentially could be the space between a two-part jig. If I was to do this curve in just a one-part jig, the part on the left would be the jig and the part on the right would be open where I would put the bend against, because you want to have the least amount of concave bending as possible. And I think going over these lumps here would be much easier if that was on the convex rather than the concave. This is a more subtle internal part here on this curve, so that would be better to do as the concave. So the part on the left would be what I would retain. Now, because I have the opportunity to get a perfect curve, I'm hoping, right, that this is going to work out that way, then I can thicken this line and use both halves when it cuts this on the chipboard. Potentially whatever this space is in the middle will be the thickness of my curve. I'm going to try and duplicate this. Duplicate. And if I can get this lined up just right, thicken my line, kind of the wrong way to do it. The other way of me having done this should have been to just thicken the line when I created it, but here we are. I think that's about as good as it's going to get. Alright, so I'm going to attach this. Get rid of that gap. Come on, attach. Or maybe I should weld. What does that do? Alright, welding will give me, hopefully, one full-on cut of that thick line. Alright, so I'm going to set up the board here. To prep my mat, I do have some blue tape, and it is the strong grip, but anytime you're cutting something fairly thick, they always recommend that you blue tape it down to your mat board. It's just some crazy wind today. It's insane. Where's Dorothy when you need her? Alright, we're gonna smack this in the middle. Run, Toto, run! It's so windy. I'm showing my age with the whole Wizard of Oz reference. Need to get her plugged in. Wow, that dust just blew up dust everywhere. It's covered. Wind. Insane. I feel like this cut is going to take an age because whenever I use the craft knife, it takes very slow, small cuts. Whenever you are cutting thick pieces on the mat board, you need to roll your little guides out of the way. So these are going to go 2 directions. Come on now. Move it. And I will need my mat knife. Craft knife. It's a craft knife tip. I guarantee that's what it's going to tell me to do. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe it's going to tell me to pop in something else, but I highly doubt it. It's probably going to be this craft blade. I'm going to click make it. I need a little bit on this template, so I'm going to just drag this towards the middle-ish. I should have changed the matte background because it's hard for y'all to probably see it. And I can just go in and chop the little bits of extra with my saw. So in theory, it should cut the outline of this. Continue. It's going to ask me my material. Heavy chipboard 2.0. Browse materials, like chipboard. Heavy chipboard 2.0. Alright, now we can load it in here and see what happens. So let's see what it takes for that 1% to go, and that'll give me an idea of time frame. Alright, so it's going to take 24 passes, and it's saying 18 minutes remaining. There's double dutying there. I was just cutting down my MDF to make it a little bit more manageable while I was waiting for this thing. And before we pop this off, you want to make sure that you finish the cut. And it looks like, yeah, if I can pull that off, we're good. And it's a pretty decent cut. We're okay there. Didn't take too long. It did take longer than the 18 minutes. It's about 20 minutes. It left me some time to grab a snack, get some water, cut down my MDF. Alright, this is where the curve is going to stop on the bend. So when I go to cut final curve, it's going to end here. So I will be cutting in a little bit extra just to relieve this. Same goes with up here. I'm going to go ahead and chop that. But I'll probably do that on a bandsaw. I have put in some tick mark indicators to where the finished curve is going to sit. This chipboard is essentially just cardboard. When I cut the MDF, I cut it really, really close so that the router has a lot less work to do and I have less of a risk of digging into this chipboard with the bearing, the ball bearing part, the flush trim bearing. I guess it's a bearing. It's not really a ball bearing. It's the bearing, the top part that rides along the curve to mimic it. It'll make sense in a minute when I start doing the cutting. I'm just gonna draw a pencil line in of the first curve here. The second line in. Come on now. Ultimately, what's going to become my jig is this section. This is going to all get cut out. I'm going to retain that. And then this will get cut out and I will have the 2 pieces. So my bend curves will go in the middle of here, my bent pieces of veneer that will get glued up. And then I can clamp this, as one. I will probably have to sink a clamp in this direction to pull that line and then some going this way to pull that curve. I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw, and I'm going to not hit my line here because I will be using this hardboard as my template when I do the flush trimming, but I want to get close to my line, as close as I feel comfortable on the bandsaw without going over. Okay, so I drilled a couple holes and I have changed out my jigsaw blade to this smaller one because this is a very tight curve. So I'm going to come in here and hopefully be able to get the rest of this cut out. That ought to do it. Normally, my MO would be to either use double-sided tape to stick this down or to screw this on. Because this is so thin, I think the double-sided tape would tear off. I would end up losing this as a template. This is just so thin that it might not be okay for screwing. I think I might just glue this on and sacrifice this piece so it'll become part of the jig, and that'll be that. I'm just gonna take my CA glue because we need this fast, but in this case I can at least get nice and close to my edges. I'm highly curious at this moment about the tightness of this on the flush trim. So before I go any further, the first thing I am going to flush trim is this inside nook, because if this is too tight, I will have to readjust the curve and cut up another one. We shall see. It's really tricky. In my bit, there's like a gap between the bearing and where the cutter head is, and that gap is almost half the distance of this thickness. I'm a little leery about taking this edge off by raising this up higher, but I think what I can do is I'll let it cut it this way. I can flip this over and then use the MDF as my guide to buzz this bit off. And holy heck sawdust, I definitely should be wearing a mask. I am incredibly stoked. This is totally worked. The possibilities of using this method are endless. I have saved my hand from endless hours of sanding and fatigue. This is like an insanely awesome thing. The next move is going to be finish to flush trim the opposite side, and then I'm gonna reset the studio here and pull out some of the veneers, and we're gonna give it a go with a glue up and see how it goes. I think I'm pretty dang happy with that. Taking a little doing just to get it into that form because of this weird bit of the curve, but that's what makes the two-part jig really great. And I gotta tell you, I don't often make two-part jigs because they're a really big pain when you're doing it all by hand. This was incredibly painless having used the Cricut. The flower has 5 points, and each one of these is meant to be 1 point. I'm going to need at least 5. I will probably need a couple extra just in case I have any issues with the bends. When it comes to bends, it's kind of like ceramics. You just gotta make some extra just in case. I'd like to have at least 3 lanterns. I don't know. Let's see how long I can crank these out. 3 would be at least 15 bends, so I'm looking at a minimum of 15 glue ups. Well, it's taken me quite some time to get these bends done. I finally have them done, and I'm going to start dealing with the cleanup. If you are interested in learning about how to do cleanup, I did a step-by-step video on cleaning up your bends. I will link that in the description so you can check that out. I'm just going to be using a combination of my bandsaw and the lathe to get this job done. Pop on some headphones and go to town. Before I go ahead and do that, I do want to make sure that I measure these out so I can deal with the least amount of sanding and as possible. Aha, one of my lights is out. I just realized that. Interesting. I have made some markers here on my jig, so I'm just gonna start with 1. And once I have 1, I will use that as the guide for the rest of them. This is very loosely bothering. I'm just gonna eyeball the straight line. I have sanded up my pieces and then I have cut some hexagons. Hex is not 5. Is hex 5? Hex is 6. It's 5. Anyway, I've cut a 5-sided shape. I am using 5 pieces of bend for each one, and I've done 1 glue up so far. I've only done the first part of the glue up. I'm going to be gluing a second one of this. I'm going to be using battery operated LED so that I don't have to deal with having running wires. Probably going to only do the first part of the glue up tonight. They will need to have that second piece put on to lock it all into place. I'm really happy with my little ladies and the way that they have come out. I have 2 of them set over there aside. I need to make a template or a pattern for the fabric part of these. They're dresses, we'll call them. They're gonna slip on over the tops. This might take a couple goes. It's close, but I need to make sure that I give a little bit of extra play. And I'm gonna go ahead and take this muslin and use it to get some sort of pattern going. I think that's probably as taut as it's gonna be. So I'm gonna go ahead and draw that line in with the invisible ink marker that I need to go get inside the house, and then I will have a pattern to get me going. My sample is stitched up. I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. I have made a template, and from there I went ahead and cut out all of my pieces. Now the one thing I did realize is when I made the template, I wish I had made extra piece here a little bit larger. What is that? So the seam line a little bit larger. I am planning on folding it over, so I had to do a very small fold. I want to make sure that this seam line is prominent and part of the detail. So I picked up some hot pink thread because this matches the very small detail of the pink that you would find inside a mountain laurel. It isn't going to be exactly the same because the mountain laurel pink has just a small layering on the inside, but I still like that little bit of that accent, so I'm going to use it for the seam lines that you're seeing right now in blue, but those are going to end up becoming pink. I'm going to be stitching up my edges in this neutral color just so that that first seam line is invisible, and then you just get that one line of the pink once I seam the pieces together. The fabric queen. Fabric queen. Yes. Almost can't decide how I like them best. I'm probably totally in shadow here, but I had to close up shop so that we could see the lanterns glow. And of course, having them installed out in the bright sunlight does not really show these lanterns really glow. I really want to just capture what it would look like in darkness or at dusk when the feast would be taking place. I think I like them best. I mean, they're nice and bright and illuminating in the white. Making them green sticks to the whole Woodland Feast and kind of pulls it all together. Anyhow, I'm really pleased with the way these lanterns turned out. I'm really excited about the idea of being able to use my Cricut to create my curve in creating the initial part of the jig. So that for me was a big help. So I'm gonna call it here for these lanterns. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe if you have not done so already, and stick around to watch this Woodland Feast all come together.